I'd like to tell you a story. About a year and a half ago, I was in Chile, where Ocean has an office. We were there with our board of directors for a board meeting, and we went to a little town called San Antonio, which is on the seashore, not far from Santiago. And while we were there, we met with a group of fishermen. They took us to their, I guess you could call it a clubhouse. It was above a cafe. You walk up the steps. I mean, imagine walking up this narrow, dark stairway. The wooden stairs are sagging. It was a bare room with a single light bulb coming from a wire. And we all sat on plastic chairs and listened to the fishermen tell us about things that were important to them. And one of the fishermen stood up and said, you know, my grandfather was a fisherman. His grandfather was a fisherman. All my life, I've fished. I used to go out and fish 6 days a week, and I would catch a boatload of fish. They would be relatively big, and I would cut them open, and from their stomach, I would find a lot of other fish. Now I go out 3 or 4 days a month because I can't catch enough fish. The fish I catch are small, and when I cut open their bellies, they're empty. I'd like to tell you 5 things that I usually talk to people about that many people find surprising about the oceans and the state that they're in today. The first thing that many of you will not find surprising, but too many people do, is that the oceans are not inexhaustible. The oceans are almost the metaphor we use when we want to describe something that's vast, something that's inconceivable to get one's mind around. The fact of the matter is that we have the capability, we have the technology these days to go out and find the life that's in the ocean and take it out. And as a society, as a global society, that's what we're doing. Some scientists a few years ago did a study and found that since 1950, they looked at 25 species of fish, the biggest fish, the predators of the oceans, the lions and tigers of the oceans. They did a study to look at the prevalence of these fish in all the oceans of the world, in the northern regions, the temperate regions, and the equatorial regions. And they found for all 25 fish in all regions of the world, in all the oceans, the same thing. Since 1950, 90% of the big fish are gone. That's since 1950. Who knows how many we've lost since 1900? In 1987, the worldwide catch of fish started to go down, and it's continuing to go down if you correct for climate change, the El Nino events, and so on, and if you correct for inaccurate data that's coming out of China. That is that the catch is falling despite the fact that the number of boats that we're putting out, the number of nets, the number of hooks is rising. In other words, the fish are missing. About 3 months ago, a group of 10 or 12 leading marine scientists published a report in Science magazine, which many of you probably know is one of the 2 leading general science publications in the United States. It's a peer-reviewed publication. And they did a study over many years. They did what's called a meta-study, looking at all the other studies, or many of them in the world, on fish prevalence. They looked at landing data. They looked at experimental data. And they found that as of 2003, 29% of the fisheries in the world had been driven to a state of collapse, which they defined as 10% or less of the unfished population. 29%. And they drew a graph and they said, if we continue to fish at this rate, without changing the way in which we do it, we will have driven every fish population in the world to a state of collapse in 40 years. If you look at, I don't know how many of you are fishermen, if you fish recreationally, if you talk to people who do, you know that every place you go, people will tell you, you know, the fish are gone, the fish are missing. There aren't as many fish. We used to catch bigger fish, now we don't catch them. If you look at what people are eating, you will see that we are eating down the food chain. Having caught and eaten many of the larger fish in the ocean, we are now starting to catch and eat the smaller fish of the ocean. one of the world's preeminent marine biologists, a man named Dr. Daniel Pauly, who's on the Oceana board, said about 10 or 12 years ago that if we change our ways, soon people will start eating jellyfish. And when he said that, he said it as a half joke. People today are eating jellyfish. Now, this, people may say, well, why should we care? Well, for one thing, 1 to 2 billion people in the world depend on fish as a primary source of animal protein. We should also care because who knows what advantages to humanity we're destroying that we'll never know about. And then we also have a choice. Do we want to be the generation that saves the right whale or that makes it go extinct? And we have that choice with many, many species. So the first thing that surprises many people is that the oceans are not inexhaustible, and we, unfortunately, are on a track, if we don't change things, to exhaust them. That's the really bad news. But there is some good news. The second thing that's surprising to most people is that nations can take actions to turn this around. Because thoughtful people who think about what's happening in the oceans may start to wonder, well, gee, if we want to change what's happening in the oceans, do we need to get the nations of the world to cooperate, which is very hard. The fact of the matter is that most, not all, but most of the life in the oceans tends to congregate towards the seashore, towards the coastal areas, because that's where there's more light, that bottom habitats are closer to the surface, there are more nutrients coming in from rivers and from upwelling from the deep ocean. And most nations in the world have extended their jurisdiction to regulate fishing to 200 miles offshore. So if you go to nations of the world, you can get change that will affect much of the life in the oceans, which makes reform easier than if you have to go to the UN or other international bodies. The third thing that's surprising is, to many people, is if you describe the nature of the problem and the magnitude of what's going on, what people find surprising is actually the solutions are not complicated. We don't need a new technology. We don't need to develop some new extraordinary systems. When we met with those fishermen in San Antonio and we heard their stories, we said to them, well, what do you think we should do? And what they said is, well, we think you should stop destroying the habitat at the bottom of the oceans with huge bottom trawls that clear-cut the bottoms. We think we should stop overfishing, and we should limit the amount of fish that we catch unintentionally and throw overboard dead or dying. And if you go to the scientists throughout the world, the same ones who wrote the studies that I talked about or any others, and you ask them, what should we do about this problem? They will tell you the same thing. And if you talk to knowledgeable policymakers who are thoughtfully analyzing the issues, they will tell you the same thing. We know exactly what needs to be done. Well, then you might say, okay, well, I understand the magnitude of the problem. I understand that nations can take action. I understand that we know what to do, but is it economically and socially feasible to take these steps? And the answer is, yes, it is feasible. The estimates of the value of the landed catch of fish throughout the world range in the area of $75 to $100 billion a year. Of that amount, estimates are a quarter to a third represent government subsidies. If you just eliminate government subsidies that promote overcapacity in the commercial fishing industry, you will eliminate a lot of uneconomic fishing, and you will eliminate a lot of the damage. What's left is an industry of maybe $75 billion is not a lot of money. There are many, many companies in the United States and in Latin America that earn net more than that in a year or maybe a quarter, just to put it in perspective. We can require sensible management of our marine resources in a way that is economically feasible, and we can do it humanely. We can take the same amount of money that we give to subsidize overcapacity in the industry, and we can help people who need to transfer to other lines of work, because this is an area, commercial fishing will have to decrease to some extent. We can use those subsidies to help them transfer into other productive jobs. Well, then, the fifth thing that people sometimes find interesting is, okay, well, I understand that it's a big problem. I understand we can take national action. I can understand that we know what to do, and maybe this is economically feasible, but I've got another great idea. Why don't we replace the fish that are in the ocean with fish farms? Because I understand that, we need fish to feed people. Why don't we just farm them? Well, that is a potential solution if we're talking about herbivorous fish, like catfish and tilapia. The thing that I think people find surprising is that fish farming for carnivorous fish, like salmon, actually doesn't help, because it takes at least 3 pounds of wild fish to feed salmon in order to raise 1 pound of salmon. So you're on a treadmill that will never end. In addition, there are other contamination problems relating to fish farming. So fish farming, although in some instances it can be helpful, is not, particularly with certain kinds of fish, an answer to the problem. So the bad news is we have a problem here that could mean that in our lifetimes, the oceans are no longer a place of plenty and of life. But the good news is that this is a problem that we can solve. Actually, one of the reasons why I work on this issue and I'm passionate about it is that I believe that this may be the largest environmental issue that we can solve in our lifetimes. And if you, some of the people in this room, some of the people who have been with us today and tonight are people who have been working on these issues in government and outside, and I am confident that working together we can.